Hi everyone, Joseph Lavoie here. Dressed like a bum if you're watching on the video feed because I got in late last night from a week in Toronto. Got up first thing this morning, went to go play soccer for 2 hours and came home. My wife, if you know my wife, she's a midwife, which means I came home and she had just snuck into bed after being awake all night long. So decided to take the time to record this instead. And that means just haven't had a chance to change and make myself camera ready. So I apologize for that. But I wanted to talk this week about podcast influencers and how they are the new power brokers and what you can do to adapt. And so I think this all starts right this week at the inauguration of Donald J. Trump. Lots of news and coverage about Joe Rogan standing in the Capitol Rotunda while career politicians were sidelined. And I think that says everything about who holds influence today. If you're in public affairs and still prioritizing traditional media over influencers, I think you're well behind. A year ago, I wrote that YouTube is a thoroughly underlooked option in the public affairs stack. It's easy to get distracted by attention-grabbing platforms like TikTok, X, or newer players like Threads or Blue Sky, but YouTube is a real workhorse in the campaign world, especially since it now doubles as a podcast platform. And I've become very bullish on podcasting for its ability to facilitate a deeper relationship between influencers and their audiences. If you can get in front of the right podcast, you can get your message in front of a very captive audience. And the podcast host relationship to me is nothing like traditional broadcast media. It's deeper, it's more personal, it's way more influential. So this week, Bloomberg took a deeper look at this relationship. It analyzed a set of massively popular podcasters and streamers who cemented themselves as the new source of information for millions of young men, using their influence to rally support for Trump and the political right. I'm going to call these podcasters the Influential Nine, and they are Aiden Ross, Andrew Schultz, the Nuck Boys, Logan Paul, Joe Rogan, Lex Fridman, Patrick Bet-David, Sean Ryan, and Theo Vaughn. But here's what makes this list fascinating. None of these guys are political experts or experienced journalists, but they carry tremendous political influence. Here is a quote from the Bloomberg piece. Reporters reviewed nearly 1,300 hours of footage from their channels, mapped out the podcasters' guest networks, and quantified the frequency of key political messages that they distributed to tens of millions of subscribers each day. To hear them tell it, America's in a desperate place, destabilized by soaring inflation, migrants streaming across the border, and the beginnings of a third world war. Gender politics have gotten out of hand while schools and the medical establishment dupe the public. The same messages were communicated in Trump's inaugural address on Monday. Now that Trump is back in power, the broadcasters are well positioned to help build support for his political agenda, transforming grievances into policy that could have lasting effects even beyond Trump's term in office. In the months leading up to the election, hosts had more politicians and pundits on their shows and discussed the issues more frequently. With the broadcasters' videos that reached over 1 million views on YouTube during the time span Bloomberg reviewed, more than a third of videos mentioned voting for the U.S. elections, often with the host explicitly calling on listeners to vote. I assume this is newsworthy to Bloomberg because the Influential Nine are not journalists or even political experts. If so, then Bloomberg is onto something political campaigners have known for the better part of the last decade. The public long ago stopped turning to experts and impartial observers for political news. And they're doing it with eyes wide open. People are not looking for both sides of an argument or a discussion anymore. They want information that aligns with their values, plain and simple. They want political information presented to them with a frame that aligns with their values. There is no single source of truth in this environment. This is your truth, this is my truth, and I only care to entertain my truth. And that's the real shift we're experiencing in how political news is consumed. People are willing to consume this news if it is delivered to them from a trusted source that shares their worldview. No specific domain expertise is required. All that's required? Empathy. Podcast hosts need only to be on the side of their listeners. That empathy makes them trustworthy. That trustworthiness makes them accessible. And that accessibility makes them influential. This empathy flywheel is powerful because it facilitates a feedback loop between host and audience. By reflecting their audience's views, they gain social capital to shape opinion on topics well beyond their original expertise. The combination of Mirroring their audience worldview and doing so empathetically means the relationship between the two is deep. Audiences feel understood, not lectured at. It's an emotional connection that transforms these hosts from content creators into trusted guides, helping their audience on their hero's journey. This transformation and the impact it is having on political discourse demands our attention, and it likely demands a pivot. What type of pivot are we talking about? Well, I think, four aspects to consider. One is authenticity over polish. The highly produced corporate tone that dominates business communications is a liability because I think it's become tone deaf. Today's influential voices succeed because they're perceived as genuine, even when discussing complex business issues or political issues. Number two, relationship building over reach. Rather than chasing the widest possible audience, success comes from cultivating relationships with podcasters and content creators whose audiences align with your stakeholder groups. So here what we're talking about is going niche, very, very, very niche. Three, sustained engagement over news cycles. The podcast format allows for deeper, more nuanced discussions that can unfold over hours rather than sound bites. And this means organizations need to think beyond the news cycle and invest in long-form content strategies. Your CEO needs to get comfortable ditching your well-prepared key message document and speak freely. And the fourth aspect of this pivot is value alignment over expertise. So while technical expertise remains important, it's no longer sufficient. Organizations need spokespeople who can authentically connect with audiences by demonstrating shared values and perspectives. If nothing else, they need to demonstrate empathy for those values. That doesn't mean being on the same page necessarily, but it does mean making an effort to understand the world through these audiences' lens and their perspectives. So those are the four aspects of the pivot. Media consumption is changing fast, and so is the definition of influence. It's a shift in how trust and authority are established between you and your audience. For public affairs professionals, the path to influence no longer runs exclusively through traditional media gatekeepers or even aligned stakeholders. It is through the trusted guides that have built empathetic relationships with their audiences, no matter what topic these influencers specialize in. So it doesn't matter that they're not political experts. If they have a deep, emotionally resonant relationship with their audience, then they carry influence. And as a result, they carry credibility on pretty much every topic they talk about. Organizations that understand and adapt to this new landscape, and by that I mean prioritizing genuine connection over polished messaging, embracing long-form dialogue over sound bites, and demonstrating real empathy for their audiences, are going to be better positioned to shape public discourse in meaningful ways. We've seen this in Canadian Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre's effective communications approach. Long-form videos that break down complex issues in a way that exudes extreme empathy. And there's a reason this communications approach resonates, because it screams, "I'm on your side." And for those of you that are reading this or listening to this on the Substack, I've embedded an example of one of those videos. So how should communicators respond to this shift? Well, I've come up with a framework. No surprise, given what I've just talked about, I'm calling this framework the empathy framework. So obviously that is an acronym. Let's break each of them down. So E in empathy means engaging empathetically. And before sharing any message, reflect the audience's values, view, and lived realities. So a practical tip here to consider is that in prep calls or research, identify the top emotional triggers, hopes, and fears you think your target audience is wrestling with. Tailor your language to demonstrate that you genuinely get it, rather than reciting corporate talking points. Corporate talking points just aren't going to cut it anymore. Okay, so that's E. Meet people where they are. Go beyond traditional media. Find the podcasters and niche content creators that are already trusted by your audience. And by this, you don't need to go too big right away, right? I'm not suggesting you need to go get on Joe Rogan anytime soon. That's going to be pretty difficult. Start small. So instead of scrambling for the big name podcasters and creators, pinpoint an industry or a community-specific podcast where your message can resonate deeply. Even if that audience is small, very small, that's a good way to start laddering your way up through the different podcast influencers. And I would suggest look for niche adjacent podcasters. Your niche may be very, very small. The number of podcasters that are talking about your industry may not be particularly huge. That's fine. You're going to want to get beyond that and find adjacent topics, because that's how you're going to start to spread your message beyond your core stakeholder group. P, here we want to prioritize authenticity over polish. Polished sound bites are less effective in an environment that values raw, relatable conversation. Coach spokespeople on your team to share real stories and experiences, because it's okay if the delivery isn't perfect. Imperfections can come across as honest and genuine, and this is increasingly what people are used to hearing when they're engaging and listening to podcasters. They're used to a very unpolished treatment. It's a lot like when blogs became of age in the early 2000s. What made them so refreshing to a lot of people is that they read very authentically, they were raw, they were very different than the polished form that they got used to on traditional channels. So don't be afraid to be very authentic, and don't seek perfection when you are communicating on these platforms. Okay, so that's PA in the empathy framework. Adopt long-form storytelling. Think beyond the 30-second clip. Podcasts, YouTube streams, and live conversations allow hours of in-depth dialogue where trust can be built, and that's how that trust is built. People need to spend a lot of time listening to you talk in a very authentic way. So prepare to go off script. Encourage your CEO, your spokesperson, or if it's you doing media or doing these interviews, be prepared to speak freely. Obviously within reason. You still have a reputation to manage, but address follow-up questions head on. We used to train spokespeople to bridge to the talking points that they wanted to drive, even when asked a question for which their answer had no applicability. Increasingly these days, people expect you to address a question head on, and even if it's not quite the answer that they want to hear from you, the appreciation for an authentic reaction is going to carry you a lot further and help you build a lot more trust. Okay, let's talk about tracking empathy. T is tracking empathy flywheel metrics. So traditional metrics, impressions, hits, reach, only show part of the picture. What you really need is a sense of how well your audience feels heard. So move to engagement-based KPIs such as sentiment and comments, hours listened, and quality of questions from the audience, and gauge how often your key points are repeated in those hosts' words. Let's move on to H, harness alignment of values. So expertise alone is no longer enough. You need to align with the audience's worldview and demonstrate you're willing to see the issue through their eyes, or that you are speaking to your topic from their perspective, or at least that you can understand where their worldview is on that topic. Explicitly connect your message to shared values, whether it's fairness or safety or freedom. You don't need to have the exact same set of values as that audience, but there are probably a couple shared ones. And if you can figure what those are before you engage, then you can bridge to those values. And if they are your true values, then it's going to be a very authentic way of engaging with that audience. Why is yield to two-way conversations? The new influencers thrive on dialogue, not monologue, and they reflect their audience, and their audience reciprocates with deeper trust. Leave space for listeners to contribute questions or comments, whether it's through live Q&A segments, social media follow-ups, but demonstrate that your appearance on that show, demonstrate that your own efforts at producing content in this medium are not just a one-way broadcast. This is something certainly I got to improve on, absolutely. And I'm doing that by launching the Craft Politics podcast. I'm going to start trying to use polls and other engagement methods to really engage with you and get to know you, my listener, better than I currently do. So I'm going to try and take my own advice on this front. So there we are. That is the empathy framework to capture or to repeat, engage empathetically, meet people where they are, prioritize authenticity over polish, adopt long-form storytelling, track empathy flywheel metrics, harness alignment of values, yield to two-way conversations. Okay, so the question then becomes, what comes next? How can I apply this framework? How can I start engaging these types of influencers? Well, I've got 7 concrete things you can consider doing either now, immediately, the next quarter, or the next year. So first is to develop an internal empathy audit. Conduct an internal audit of current messaging, content, and spokesperson training to identify gaps where empathy can be strengthened. Ask yourself, are we speaking at our audience or with them? And you can get a good sense of that by reviewing your key message documents on your key issue sets. Likelihood is a lot of it is written from your perspective, or your organization's perspective, not necessarily from the perspective of your audience. And so ask yourself, are we addressing their concerns, or are we just pushing our agenda? So that's number one, develop an internal empathy audit. Number two, map the new influence ecosystem. Identify the key digital influencers, podcasters, and creators who resonate most with your stakeholders. Build a database of potential engagement opportunities. So use tools like SparkToro, BuzzSumo, or manual engagement tracking to find influential voices that might not be on your radar. So that's mapping the new influence ecosystem. Number three, invest in test and learn pilots. So instead of overhauling your entire media approach overnight, which will be difficult, it's hard to break old habits, why don't you pilot podcast or YouTube appearances to gauge effectiveness and then adjust messaging accordingly? So work with mid-tier influencer first, track engagement, audience sentiment, then start scaling up, as I talked about earlier. Number four, redefine stakeholder engagement models. Shift from one-way communication, so press releases, corporate statements, to interactive, two-way engagement platforms like Twitter Spaces, LinkedIn Live, AMA style podcast sessions. And you can do this by planning interactive sessions quarterly, where stakeholders can ask questions directly and receive honest, unscripted answers. This does not have to be an exceptionally stressful affair. In fact, the less scripted it is, the more organic it is, then the higher the chances are your content's going to perform better. So that was number four. Number five, leverage employee advocacy programs. Train employees at all levels to become authentic storytellers and micro-influencers within their networks. In fact, you might even want to encourage employees to share their perspectives on industry challenges via LinkedIn posts, guest podcast appearances, or their own content. Let them start their own podcast. Let them start their own blog in which they have the power to speak authentically on the topics, industries that matter to you, your organization, particularly in the public affairs space. That was number five. Number six, create episodic content. So develop recurring content formats. So for example, state of the industry podcast episodes, so that you become familiar with the medium, with the processes involved to publish in this type of format, and over time establish thought leadership within key audiences. So here you can consider things like a monthly CEO Q&A podcast where leadership answers top industry questions, and that could provide an ongoing authentic engagement for your key audiences. And then finally, number seven, in terms of things you can start doing this year or this quarter or today, crisis preparedness designed for this new media landscape. So update your crisis communications playbook to account for the rapid spread of narratives that can permeate very quickly now through influencer channels and podcasts. And look to identify and pre-engage trusted voices who can advocate on your behalf during times of crisis. So that's not a particularly new idea, probably something you're doing all the time on a traditional earned media approach. But now really taking a hard look at the podcast space, you're probably going to discover that the metrics attached to some of these podcasts are far outperforming traditional media. We saw this again. I'm going to use a Canadian example. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre was on Jordan Peterson's podcast over the holiday break, and the sheer volume, the sheer number of views and engagements that interview has had across multiple platforms is significantly more meaningful than Pierre Poilievre could have attained through traditional media. Something for you to consider as you need to navigate the media landscape on your public affairs issue sets. Go find those podcasters, consider launching your own podcast. And yes, YouTube is a platform that I remain very bullish on, but it's not because of the platform. It's just that the emotional connection, the deep relationships that these influencers have with their audiences are very difficult to find on many other platforms. And I think they are it's the perfect spot to explore complex regulatory or political issues with your key audiences. There we go. Hope you find that interesting. If you did find this interesting, don't be afraid to please share the podcast with your friends. Maybe give it a 5-star review and let me know what you think of today's episode. You can always shoot me an email. You can do so through my Substack. You can find the Substack at powershifts.pro in your browser. And of course, you can leave a comment wherever you are getting this podcast. Okay, everyone, we'll talk soon.